The advent of modern nation-states and the expansion of global trade required a more organized, permanent, and systematic approach to diplomacy, laying the foundations for the diplomatic career that we recognize today. A diplomat's role has been shaped not just by political changes but also by evolving intellectual frameworks that address both international law and the personal qualities of those involved in diplomatic work. The prestige of the diplomat's career has always been linked to the power and influence they wield on the global stage, but the 18th century and beyond saw new ideas, systems, and practices that have made diplomacy a coveted career today. Diplomatic foundations, 1700s, the rise of modern diplomacy. The 1700s marked a pivotal century in the evolution of diplomacy, driven by the development of modern nation-states, the rise of permanent embassies, and the increasingly institutionalized approach to managing international relations. Before this time, diplomacy was often characterized by occasional missions, where envoys were sent for specific treaties or negotiations. By the 18th century, with the consolidation of power in centralized states and the increasing complexity of international relations, the profession began to take its modern form. François de Calliers de la manière de négocier avec les souverains, 1716, often regarded as one of the first treatises on diplomacy, emphasized the personal qualities needed for effective diplomacy: tact, prudence, and negotiation skill. Calliers suggested that a diplomat's success depended as much on their character and ability to maintain personal relationships with foreign leaders as on their formal training in political affairs. He argued that diplomacy required a deep understanding of human nature, with a focus on discretion, cultural sensitivity, and trust in negotiations. The work of Emer de Vattel, particularly in The Law of Nations, 1758, brought the legal framework into diplomacy. Vattel emphasized the importance of state sovereignty, international law, and the diplomatic immunity that should protect ambassadors and envoys while serving abroad. His work underpinned much of the legal basis for diplomacy, contributing to the development of a system in which diplomats acted as representatives not only of their rulers but also as defenders of international law. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, which ended the War of Spanish Succession, is a seminal example of 18th century diplomacy. It was negotiated by diplomats representing various European powers and established the idea of balance of power diplomacy, which sought to prevent any one nation from becoming too dominant. This concept would later guide much of European diplomacy, especially in the 19th century. In this period, permanent diplomatic missions, embassies, began to replace the earlier system of temporary envoys, signaling a shift toward a professionalized diplomatic service. The increasing complexity of global trade, military alliances, and colonial empires required full-time diplomats to maintain continuous communication between states. The growth of commercial diplomacy also took hold as European powers established colonies and traded goods across the world. 19th century, the rise of institutional diplomacy. By the 19th century, the role of the diplomat had become increasingly institutionalized and professionalized. The Congress of Vienna, 1815, which was convened to redraw Europe's political boundaries after the Napoleonic Wars, exemplified the increasing importance of multilateral diplomacy. The Congress marked a turning point, with diplomats representing multiple states working together to prevent future wars and establish a system of collective security in Europe. The balance of power framework was formalized, establishing the idea that diplomacy should seek to prevent domination by any one power through alliances and treaties. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, 1961, although a later development, had roots in the 19th century ideas of diplomatic immunity and the sanctity of diplomatic missions that had been developed by Vattel and others. It provided a more formal, international structure for diplomacy, further professionalizing the career of the diplomat. This period also witnessed the establishment of formalized diplomacy, with diplomatic services emerging across Europe. Countries such as Britain, France, and Russia began to establish professional consular services, and foreign ministries became central institutions in national governments. Diplomacy in the 19th century was also defined by the emergence of imperialism and colonial diplomacy, with diplomats increasingly negotiating for territorial expansions and resources in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, where European powers divided Africa among themselves, is one such example of how diplomacy was entwined with imperial ambitions. 20th century, modern diplomacy and multilateralism. The 20th century saw diplomacy expand beyond traditional state-to-state relations to include multilateral diplomacy, driven by global organizations such as the League of Nations and later the United Nations, UN, 1945. The impact of two world wars underscored the necessity of diplomacy to prevent conflict and resolve global crises. During the interwar period, Woodrow Wilson's idea of collective security and the establishment of the League of Nations, 1919, reflected a new approach to diplomacy, one that focused on peacekeeping and multilateral cooperation rather than power balances. This shift from bilateral diplomacy, between two countries, to multilateral diplomacy, involving many states, continued with the founding of the United Nations, 1945, which was designed to provide a forum for the peaceful resolution of disputes and the promotion of human rights. The Cold War period, 1947 to 1991, also introduced diplomacy as a tool for ideological competition. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union saw the rise of summit diplomacy, where heads of state and high-ranking diplomats would meet to resolve tensions and prevent nuclear conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, and détente diplomacy are key examples of high-stakes diplomacy during this period. Another significant development in the 20th century was the rise of economic diplomacy. The creation of global financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank required diplomats to navigate complex trade negotiations, foreign aid, and financial agreements. Economic diplomacy has become a key feature of modern diplomatic careers, with diplomats often involved in negotiations related to global trade, financial regulations, and development aid. Late 20th century to present, digital diplomacy and new global challenges. As we enter the 21st century, the landscape of diplomacy shifted once more with the advent of digital technology and the increasing interconnectedness of global challenges. The rise of social media and digital platforms enabled diplomats to engage with a wider global audience, promoting public diplomacy and expanding the reach of diplomatic efforts. Diplomacy today is also defined by new challenges such as climate change, cybersecurity, and global health, with diplomats often working on multilateral platforms like the Paris Agreement, 2015, to address issues that transcend national borders. Additionally, the profession has expanded to include non-state actors such as NGOs, corporations, and global institutions, all of which play a role in shaping diplomacy. 21st century, digital and public diplomacy. In the 21st century, diplomacy has continued to evolve with the advent of new technologies and the increasing interdependence of global economies. Digital diplomacy, also known as twiplomacy, has transformed how diplomats communicate and engage with the public. Social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have given diplomats a direct line to the public, allowing for public diplomacy in ways that were once unimaginable. Diplomacy has also become more inclusive, with a growing emphasis on the role of non-state actors such as international NGOs, multinational corporations, and global civil society. Climate change diplomacy, for example, the Paris Agreement of 2015, reflects this shift, with countries working together to address global challenges that transcend national borders. Furthermore, the rise of global security concerns, from cybersecurity to terrorism and pandemics, has required diplomats to adapt. The challenges of global health diplomacy, seen most acutely during the COVID-19 pandemic, reflect the evolving scope of diplomatic efforts in today's interconnected world. Public diplomacy has emerged as a critical tool for influencing foreign publics and shaping perceptions abroad, as governments use media, cultural exchanges, and international broadcasting to achieve foreign policy goals. Conclusion. From the 18th century to the present, the role of the diplomat has evolved significantly, adapting to changes in political power, global communication, and international cooperation. The professionalization of diplomacy that began in the 1700s, particularly with the ideas of thinkers like Colliers and Vattel, laid the groundwork for the career of the modern diplomat. Through wars, treaties, economic systems, and technological changes, diplomacy has transformed from a tool for individual monarchs and empires to a complex, multilateral field that influences global peace, trade, and security. The diplomat's career remains a highly coveted one, offering the unique opportunity to shape global history and engage with a variety of cultures, political systems, and international issues. As we look toward the future, the diplomat's role will likely continue to adapt, responding to the challenges and opportunities presented by globalization, digital communication, and the shifting dynamics of global power.